Hello and welcome back to another tutorial video making use of FactoryIO with the Siemens S7-1200 PLC. In this video we're going to be adding the FactoryIO stacker to the box sorting conveyor system we programmed in previous videos. However, this time we're going to be coding in a program called SCL, which is a high-level language based on Pascal. So if that's something of interest to you, then please stay tuned. So let's start the system and have a look at what we're trying to achieve. Let's zoom out a bit and see the bigger picture. So pallets with boxes start coming down the entry conveyor, the first being a large height box and the second being a small height box which will be sent towards the stacker crane. More small height boxes start to follow. The first small height box is sent to position 1 in the rack. Notice that the conveyors stop as soon as the small loader conveyor can't release the last small height box because the left conveyor is stopped while the stacker crane is busy. This is now a bottleneck which can be quite common in the real world, where one operation which is slow can stop another operation from happening. However, as soon as the stacker crane forks return and the next box is picked up, the large box is allowed onto the small loader conveyor, as we can see. So the stacker crane will keep placing small height boxes and pallets into the rack until the rack is completely full with 54 pallets, and at that point it will stop. Okay, I think you get the idea. Let's stop FactoryIO. Now I should point out that we will be amending the program at a later date to allow boxes to be released from the rack and placed on the far side conveyor for removal from the system, so that space can be made available for more pallets to be sent to the rack. So it's worth keeping an eye out in the text section below for a link to this in the future. If you haven't subscribed, it might be a good idea to do so now and select the bell too. That way you would be informed as soon as a new video becomes available. Right, moving on. Let's just take a quick look at how the inputs and outputs are set up. I might be jumping the gun a little here as we are about to go through this step by step. So please try and bear with me for a minute. If you watched the previous videos, I've placed the links in the comments section below. You will notice that we now have additional inputs, input 1.5 to input 2.3 added, as well as outputs Q1.2 to Q1.6 for the stacker crane system. We also have an additional output, word QD104. If we now have a look at the configuration, where the number and type of I/O required are set up, we can see we've added more inputs. Now 23, and more outputs, now 20, plus an additional D word. Okay, let's close FactoryIO and let's close the Siemens S7-1200 TIA portal, presently displaying the SCL code in a function block. Oops, let's not forget to stop the PLC first while we move on to set up FactoryIO. Okay, closing the project. We will now open up FactoryIO again. We'll go full screen so we can see it in more detail. And we'll open up the automated warehouse scene, which is one of 20 industrial scenes supplied with FactoryIO. Now let's dock all the tags, and what I'd like to do is demonstrate the process of how a pallet is picked up and placed in the rack by forcing the outputs manually in exactly the same way they would be when programmed in SCL. It's a completely sequential process which makes the programming a little easier. Right, let's force the forks left. Oops, I need to put FactoryIO into play mode first, then force the actuator. Okay. You can see the forks going out, which would be under a pallet. Then we need to lift the forks to pick up the pallet. Let's just arrange the scene so we can get a better look first. That's okay. Then let's activate the lift actuator. That would pick up the pallet. So now we need to bring the forks back to the mid position, and we do that by deselecting the forks left actuator, and the forks return to the center. Once that is done, we need to send the stacker crane to a position in the rack, and we do that by entering a number from 1 to 54 in the target position D word. Let's type in position 5, then enter and see what happens. The stacker crane then moves to that position in the rack, where we can extend the forks to the right to unload a pallet. So let's select the right actuator, then deselect the lift actuator, followed by deselecting the forks right actuator. Great. Now what we have to do is enter 55 in the target position to send the stacker crane back ready to accept the next pallet. So let's do that. 55 and enter, and we are back where we started, ready for another pallet. Right, let's stop FactoryIO and close the scene, and we won't save it. Now we will start FactoryIO up again, and this time load the scene from the previous tutorial, ready for us to make the amendments, which we can then start to program. Let's open my sorting by height system 2 and start adding in everything required for this stacker crane and rack tutorial. The first thing we need to do is remove the fencing because some of it gets in the way and would make it difficult to add the stacker crane. We can add the appropriate fencing later when we've finished setting up if we wish. Now we need to delete the left side remover, and to do that, let's first rotate the conveyors around by using the right mouse button and dragging, and we can then position the scene to allow us to work on the left side of the conveyors. That looks fine. Now if we right click on the top of the remover arrow, then select delete, the remover will disappear. Next, we need to move the sensor with the reflector to the end of the conveyor. Oops, that's not quite the right place. Let's pick it up again and move it. Oh, moved the conveyor by mistake. Let's put it back and try to move the sensor right to the end. Okay, that's better. Now we need to bring in a loading conveyor, so let's drag it in onto the floor. Let's right click on it and yaw it around so the direction of travel of the motor is in the right direction. Okay, now let's move it into position. I'm just going to select the left arrow on the keyboard to move the scene to the right of screen, then come out a little and then zoom in. Now you can see the direction arrows on the loading conveyor, so we know it's pointing in the right direction. Now we'll position the scene to allow us to place a reflector sensor at the end of the loading conveyor. Let's find it in the object list by scrolling down. There it is. Let's drag it onto the scene. Now we can see it's a little high, so if we hold the V key down on the keyboard while dragging the sensor down until the white grid lines disappear on the conveyor. There we go. Then drag it up again till the white grid lines reappear, which means we are at the correct height. Then we can let go of the V key and drag the sensor onto the conveyor. There we go. Now let's yaw the sensor around so that the beam is pointing in the right direction. Let's just rotate the scene so we can make sure the sensor is in position. It just needs moving a little. That's great. Done. Now let's bring in the reflector and place it on the other side of the conveyor. We need to yaw this too. Rotate the scene again to get a better view, then use the V key again to bring it down to the correct height, just like we did for the sensor. That looks okay, and then place it on the conveyor in position. It doesn't look quite right. Let's have a look. Yes, that's not quite in position. Let's move it to the left a little. That looks good. Actually, I'll move the sensor in slightly. We can move it back out later if need be. Great stuff. Okay, let's rotate the scene around so we can add the stacker crane and racks in. Let's drag the stacker crane into the scene and let's yaw it around. Now let's drag it roughly into position. The forks seem to be lining up okay. Let's rotate the scene around and check the distance between the loading conveyor and the stacker crane. I can move it in a little closer. Then let's check I haven't moved the forks out of position by rotating the scene back around. That looks fine. Let's now bring in a rack unit and let's yaw it around. It's gone red because it's overlapping another object in the scene. So let's move it roughly into position. And let's rotate the scene around to check its position. It could go in a little, so let's do that. Okay, that looks about right. Now we need to check the alignment of the rack with the positioning of the stacker crane forks when we send them to a position in the rack. To do that, from the File menu, let's select Dock All Tags, then put FactoryIO into play mode. Then enter 1 in the stacker crane target position and press enter. Then the stacker crane forks move to position 1, and if we rotate the scene a little, we can see that the forks do not quite line up with the rack. So let's stop FactoryIO and move the rack slightly to the left. Okay, let's try that by starting FactoryIO up again. This time it looks fine, so let's just test the position by extending the forks to the right and then raising them to make sure they don't hit the rack sides. And it all looks fine. I'll just rotate the scene to get a better look, and it looks good. The only thing I might say is that we may have to bring the rack closer to the stacker crane so that the forks go further in, but we will check that while programming. Okay, let's disengage the fork actuators and return the stacker crane to its home position by typing 55 into the stacker crane target position and pressing enter. Now let's add 2 more racks by firstly stopping FactoryIO and then right-clicking on the first rack and selecting duplicate. Then drag it into position. That looks good. Let's make some room by clearing all the docked tags. Then for the third rack, instead of duplicating one of the existing racks, we'll select one from the list of objects again. We can, of course, do it either way. Okay, place it down and then yaw it before putting it into place. That looks good. I'm just going to look from above to make sure the racks are all in line. Yes, that looks fine. I'll just rotate the scene around and check from the other side too. Again, holding the right mouse button and dragging around, all looks good. Now let's have a look at the inputs and outputs and how we can wire them into the PLC. So select File, then Drivers. Firstly, we can see we don't have enough I/O, so let's go to the configuration page and add some in. Okay, on the Boolean inputs, let's type in about another 10 inputs. Oops, not 10 inputs, another 10 on top of what was already there. So there were 14 originally, so let's type in 24. Then in the outputs, let's type in 22. We also need to add another D word for the stacker crane target position. So type in 2 there. That looks fine. So let's return to the previous page and start allocating I/O. So the first input available is 1.6, all the way down to input 2.7. And the outputs available are from Q1.3 to Q2.5, as well as QD104. I suppose I should point out we don't need all of these at the moment, but we may use them later. So let's start dragging down the inputs. We'll start with stacker crane 1 moving X and work our way down, adding them to the host. So we just drag them over and let go when we're on the host input that we require. It's quite straightforward, one by one. The last input we need is Reflector Sensor 5, which was the sensor we placed on the loading conveyor next to the stacker crane. Okay, they are done, so now let's add the outputs in the same way. We'll start with stacker crane lift to host address Q1.3 and work our way down. Then crane left and right, not forgetting the loading conveyor, which we'll place on Q1.6. And the last one is the stacker crane 1 target position, which we'll place on QD104. And that's it, all done. So we just need to save the scene, and I'll call it My Sorting by Height System and Stacker 1. We can also type in a description, then save. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll start coding in SCL, although we do have a few ladder logic changes to do to the previous code before we start entering SCL. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Please remember to subscribe and hit the bell so that you'll be informed of future video uploads as soon as they become available, and also please feel free to make any comments. Also, if you'd like to purchase FactoryIO, you can do it from a link in the description. It does give me a small commission, which is great, and it allows me to produce videos like this, which hopefully help you to code PLCs now and in the future. Anyway, until next time, thanks for watching and hope you have a good day. Bye for now.